Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, our coffee break webinar, the value of a rights bill of materials. I'm Brian O'Leary, Executive Director of the Book Industry Study Group, and I want to welcome you to what's the second in a four-part series on rights and royalties. This webinar follows a separate one, Managing Subscription Royalties, that we hosted on June 25th. That recording is available on the BISG website, and we'll have a link to it if you have trouble navigating to it at the end of this presentation. I also want to let you know that this and other sessions are being recorded. If you've registered for this session, whether you attend or not, you'll receive a link to the presentation about a day after the presentation ends. We're lucky today to have Paul Gore returning from FADEL returning to us to talk about a rights bill of materials. This is actually one of his favorite subjects. He might not tell you that, but it is. And he's very passionate about the opportunity. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Paul, thank him for his time, and turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Brian, and thanks everyone for joining, for spending a few minutes together on a summer afternoon here. So I'm going to take us through one of the notions here. Apologies, my screen is okay. Is my screen back on display?
Yep, you're fine. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, what I'm going to do is just take us through a couple concepts. None of these are particularly new, but what we have is that with the transformation that's happening in publishing and with how publishing products are made, sold, and distributed, we're starting to see a lot more complexity that's been spilling down into royalty platforms, which creates complexity in the platforms and makes things a bit harder to manage than they need to be. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about one of those topics. It's one of a series of topics. This one is rights bill of materials, and it's really intended to streamline the royalty operations related to custom products. So just to put it all into context, what is this rights bill of materials? As we all know, publishing products are very frequently built by combining one or multiple works together in new or innovative ways. And in fact, that's more and more even at traditional publishers who typically produce a single work in multiple formats. We're seeing this type of product becoming more frequently done. Now, without a clean way to identify how that content is assembled, managing the royalties and the earnings back to the authors can prove a bit challenging. So for some of the legacy royalty systems that aren't really rights driven, they need to be configured in fairly complex ways to account for things like splits between components. So if I have a custom pub book, which was made up of components of 3 other books, what many royalty systems will force you to do is to start splitting down the rates for each of the authors in each of their contracts, when there might be a simpler way to get the job done. Especially if it's becoming a more prevalent way of doing business. And some of the evolving technology in publishing platforms is also creating situations where this custom content or hybrid content is being generated or being produced on a more regular basis. So, the scaling up of this, you really can't just keep pushing the problem back to the royalty teams. There's ways to handle this a little bit up front. And we're going to introduce the notion of the rights bill of materials for helping to manage that. So now I want to be clear. In the last session, we had a discussion about subscriptions and subscription royalty processing and compensating authors for their contributions to subscription platforms. This is not the same. So subscription processing is more about allocating your subscription revenue across a platform containing many products and content, and where that usage is the driver for royalty. For the rights bill of material, it's more about producing a product that stands on its own. It's been assembled from perhaps multiple titles and content, but it is a product unto itself. And the compensation to the contributors is usually based on some percentage of the content that is in the resulting product. Let's see if I get quicker at this. Okay. So the and there are some very good content platforms, and there are publishers doing some very advanced work to keep track of every content element that is inside their products and inside their books. However, that sometimes is too granular to really do an effective job for helping to manage the compensation and the royalties. You almost need something at that middle level. And this idea of a rights bill of materials is all about that. It's about identifying what the component titles are and what the percent contribution to the new product is, so that that can be used later in the calculations. So, and as we all know, publishing processes start with title management. And title management at most publishers is typically done at a higher level, like for the work or the property, for the intellectual property that's been acquired. And ISBNs are, of course, used. I mean, they are a bit legacy, but they are used, still to identify specific versions or formats of a publication. Or there may, in fact, be multiple ISBNs for a single format, as we all know. And one of the unfortunate realities is many other supporting platforms that surround title management, from your P&Ls to financial systems to royalty systems, and of course inventory systems where it's required, but many of these other platforms are still managed by ISBN. So ISBN level management does force some additional complexity, even even beyond the complexity that you have when you're combining multiple products together. So we're going to start with the notion that we've got a good title management in place. We understand what a work is and how a work is combined into a custom product or into a publishing product that's been produced. So now, if we go back, or if we talk about more of the physical things, this is less of an issue. So I'm distinguishing this. There is traditional processes of bundling, box sets, kits, where the bundled product is actually produced, it's manufactured, and there is a process that's managed through the ERP platforms with a bill of materials within the ERP to manage the construction of the product, which has been pulled together. In these cases, the component products are typically included in their entirety, and that bill of materials is used downstream by the accounting for revenue recognition and royalty systems to perform calculations based on the component products. The slang for that is, you explode your bill of material in order to understand what the component products are, so that you can compensate your authors who produced the component titles that were in place. This is pretty straightforward. Most systems handle this. It's actually a typical physical process. Now, in custom publishing, it's a little different. You've got portions of multiple works that can be combined together to form up a new product. And given that this percentage of the content from each of your source or each of your original titles can vary, then there can be varying royalties that you pay to each contributor. So based on the percentage of content, or based on the way that that's been divvied up. So you don't generally have a bill of material for managing these products. They're pretty much treated as a unique new product. You may also have a content platform that has very detailed information about it, but again, it's not really rolled out. So what that means is that the accounting teams and the royalty teams at the back end of the process have to deal with these new products as they come their way, and to figure out who should be getting credit, what should be the % credit, and if terms of contracts change, they've got to sift through a lot of these types of products in order to keep that sorted out. It's a lot of work, and I'm afraid to say there's a great deal of royalty platforms that actually force a lot of this work to be done, just because of the nature of how things evolved over the years. An alternate way of doing it is to use essentially a rights bill of material, which is comparable to the physical bill, in that you have a product that's with a list of component products, but what you're keeping with that is not necessarily a manufacturing process where you have instructions on how to construct it, but you actually keep track of the % of content for each of the components. And what that does is that glues together the product that you've sold with the component titles that went into the product, along with the % allocation of that component content in. So that the idea is to set that up once, perhaps as part of title management, or if your title management system can't do it, you do it in your royalty platform. Once you've set that up, then your royalty and revenue recognition systems can actually pick that up, and instead of just exploding your bill of materials into the components, it can use the content % as part of the calculation in order to come up with a proper allocation. The benefits here are, as you set up the new products with these rights bill of materials, you don't have to tell the royalty team about it. You don't have to tell the accounting team. The systems will pick those new products up, perform the calculations according to the designated percentages, and your sales won't get stuck or go into suspense and not be able to be included in royalty statements and processing later. So, of course, there's always the exception. Every rule is almost defined by that, and you may still have some contract-specific splits where, even though the content is 40% one work and 60% another work, that you may have a special deal with one of those authors where they get a disproportionate %. Of course, you want to be able to set that up in your contract side as well. So, but that's the idea is to make that the exception and not the regular way of processing. So to sort of put this in perspective, and this is sort of a narrow area, but who needs this most is publishers that combine content from multiple sources to create a new product, and pretty much all publishers, and publishers and third parties that create custom works from components, whether previously published or not. I guess one other point to make here is, if there is a lot of pain going on in the processing side, or inaccuracy or delays in getting things processed, you probably have a clue that there may be some inefficiencies that are baked into the process that might be well served by this approach. And for those who have this situation, how do you get started in putting together this rights bill of materials approach? A great way to start would be, start with the front list, the books that have not yet gone out, so you at least pick up things going forward. From there, you go after your backlist, titles that have multiple components. Obviously, you pick up your highest revenue ones, or the ones that are for the most important authors, from a revenue or from any other criteria, to make sure that when creating the custom products, that you understand what legal obligations you have before you propose any changes for the payments or for the share of work. Sometimes this can be very specifically stipulated in the contracts, and that needs to be respected. And of course, work with your title management and rights and royalty system providers or in-house teams to confirm what they can provide. Not every system has this kind of capability built in, but there are ways to plug this type of process into an existing setup. So, and of course, if you're looking to invest in a new process or new system, just make sure you understand how any new system is going to support these types of operations, how much work it's going to put your teams through in order to support that going forward. I see a lot of intent towards, I'll say, lift and shift, where let's just pick up what we're doing and then do it in the new system. Whereas sometimes if you transform the process a bit, you can pick up some pretty good efficiencies in how you operate with this. So, I'll throw it open to questions. I know, Brian, you may have some, or there may be some from the group that have come in.
We do, and we probably have time for a few more as well. Yeah. If for folks who are interested in asking Paul a question, you can add one to the questions box that's on the control panel that you have about 5 items down. I'll be monitoring those and sharing them with Paul as we go. So a couple that have come in, a question to talk about, I don't think you used this word, but being keyed to an ISBN. What is it that, how is it that systems are classically set up, and what is it about them that creates that limitation that you're trying to overcome?
So, I think when you have an ISBN, very heavily ISBN driven process, there tends to be a lot of duplication of information about the collections of ISBNs that exist for the same title or for the same work. And while that it can be well managed through a good title management process, that doesn't always propagate into the downstream systems. So it's really something to be aware of, when setting up or when modernizing systems, is to take a look at whether the ISBN model needs some tweaking or enhancement going forward, to avoid some of the duplication of work and replication of information.
And is it the case that most solutions that are currently in the marketplace are start with the ISBN as the organizing identifier, or is it more blended?
I don't know that it's really a solution limitation. It's in many cases it's an approach. It's how things have been done, and sometimes it's easier, even when putting in a new solution, to just plug in the same way it's been done, and to really not look at some of the more difficult to set up transformation that even though it may yield some benefits over the long term. So it's a thought process. It's very well ingrained within publishing. So.
And not necessarily reflective of what's happening, at least when it comes to recombinant or multi-component books or content offerings.
Yes, there's complexity alone just through the prevalence of use of ISBN. That creates its own complexity, and that really multiplies the complexity when dealing with components, because then the component or custom products that are built up of components, in many cases in an ISBN-based system, the only tools available to a publisher is to say that this product is built of these 5 or 6 or 2 or 3 ISBNs, when in fact it's really based on the work, on the title, and on the original content that went into all the different ISBNs. So you come up with this arbitrary approach where you pick an ISBN when it's not exactly the right way to associate that. So it magnifies the complication when you have this situation.
And then this feels like a two-part question. So you talked a bit about content percentages, and I think you like a 40-60 split.
Mhm.
One question is, how is that percentage determined? Is it by page, by chapters,
Um,
or is there no rule of thumb in that regard?
I don't have a rule of thumb on that. And in fact, I think you can go down a rat hole on that topic as well. Um, and that's where I was pointing out this bill of materials as this balance between going all the way into the content platforms where you can get that kind of information, but it becomes almost unnecessary detail because ultimately it's a business arrangement that dictates that that this is the percentage split that's going to be represented here. It may not be exactly the content split or page count or number of words. It's really a business designation that's been put in place.
Yeah, and in that regard, the second part of this question was, so the not the content percentage, but rather the allocation is one of it can be determined in a number of different ways. It's just there's no one option that dominates or dictates what the share should be.
I think if you look from publisher to publisher, that's a true statement. Within a specific publisher, there may be standard practices that are done in a uniform way within a publisher or within a publishing unit. But the idea is that the notion of the rights bill of materials is that you render the end result of that calculation in a clean, organized way so that your calculations at the end can be auditable, can be done consistently, and can be done without incurring a lot of extra work on behalf of the accounting and royalties folks.
Does this require a change in how royalties are reported? You spent some time on last month, and actually, while I'm at it, the last link on the page that's up right now, the Go to Stage link, is the link to the webinar you did last month on managing subscription royalties. Yep. But the question was, essentially, how do you report that information? Does reporting information on a Bill of Rights basis require changes in how royalties are reported or to maintain transparency?
It's an opportunity to provide more transparency. You can have the rights bill of material in place in order to perform a comparable calculation as done, hopefully with a streamlined process, and still produce the same legacy style statements that are produced today. But it does also offer the opportunity to provide additional information about the nature of the calculation and how it was arrived at. So I think it's an opportunity to provide more transparency, but it doesn't require.
Thanks. I mean, that's really helpful. Another question, it touches upon legacy solutions and practices. I know you're not here to talk about specific platforms, but there is this question of how do we maintain our flexibility or agility as we create new products and services that are not necessarily built the way rights and royalties have been either determined or allocated in the past. What is the impact of, I guess the phrase you used was lift and shift, meaning take what you already have in place and put it in a new bucket or a new system. Right. How do we move beyond that, and how quickly do you think we need to be thinking about that?
Well, there's actually a couple things going on within BISG that are going to be very helpful for this. The one is the work being done with the ROI project, because that work, which BISG has engaged, is really going to help publishers to understand what the benefits are for establishing some, sort of a broader rights approach, a rights-based approach to managing the royalties, and I think that having that ROI available is going to help folks to understand how to get at that and what the real benefits of it are. And I could go for a long time on this particular topic, but what I will say is that there is an upcoming there is an upcoming session that we're going to be talking about a global rights model. And in that area, I'll be talking a little bit about how having a global rights model can help, push the ISBN centric issue a little bit more into the background and make it less of an issue.
I think, thank you for mentioning the Rights ROI project. I'm actually going to be, we're going to be having our newsletter next Tuesday. The lead will be an article on that project, which kicked off last month and will probably run through late September before the final report is available. It's we've contracted with Giant Steps Media Technology Strategies to examine the ROI for solutions investments across the industry. They had one other question, which is about the product mix. You mentioned as a couple of cases, the companies or the types of publishers that would be most benefited by taking an approach to or using a rights bill of materials as an approach. But I can imagine that as the product mix changes in other parts of the business, that's also going to promote either a need for systems changes or approaches like the one you're talking about today.
Yes, absolutely, yes, it is. At the end, in the far future, I could see some very sophisticated models with the modeling of content and how content is pulled together. We're not quite there. Rights bill of materials is a good approach. It gets us on the path, and I think sets us up for some of those futures as well.
So just as in our last couple of minutes, I wanted to mention that we do have on July 30th a 30-minute coffee break webinar on the global rights model, and then on August 20th, again at 3 p.m., publisher to publisher rights mapping versus taxonomy, the session that you alluded to a few minutes ago. We're looking forward to those conversations, and I know you and I have a little bit of work to do to plan them, but those should be fun.
Yep.
Any last thoughts for the folks who are, the rights bill of materials, as I said at the outset, is not new to you, but it's a relatively new idea to some of the folks who joined us today. Maybe one or two things just to keep in mind to get started on this.
Yeah, I think it's it gets to the final couple points, which is if you're currently experiencing a lot of inefficiency in your royalty process, if it's taking a lot of time, if there's inaccuracy that are coming out of that, this is definitely worth a look. It does not necessarily require a new royalty system, although if you are putting starting to look at other solutions, it should definitely be factored into your search.
Thanks. I think that's really important for people to keep in mind is if you're feeling the pain, then that's a sign not of pain, but of a need for a solution that might be different from the one that you currently have in place.
That's right. Yes.
Paul, it's always fun talking to you, and I know we'll be doing a lot more but going forward, but thank you for making the time today, for putting these thoughts together, and for sharing your perspective on rights bill of materials.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Take care.